July 21st, 1873, Adair, Iowa. 3 hours until midnight. Chicago Rock Island and Pacific Railroad's train, number 4, was moving through the darkness toward the Missouri border. Passengers were sleeping in the cars. Engineer John Rafferty, with 22 years of experience, was listening to the sound of the rails. But that night, none of them knew. America's most famous outlaw gang was waiting for them. Now I'm going to tell you the untold story of Jesse James. The truth that history books didn't write. The disaster behind the legend created by the media. Because that night, the Wild West's biggest train robbery plan would turn into one of history's greatest failures. Jesse Woodson James. The name should sound familiar. America's Robin Hood, the hero who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. At least that's what the newspapers wrote. But the truth was nothing like that. Jesse was born in Missouri in 1847. He grew up in a Southern family. His father was a preacher, but he abandoned the family when Jesse was 3 and went to California, where he died. His mother remarried. Growing up on the farm, Jesse was an ordinary kid, until the Civil War started. When war broke out in 1861, Jesse was only 14 years old. But Missouri was the bloodiest state of the war. Savage battles raged between Union sympathizers and Confederate sympathizers. The James family were Confederate supporters, and the price was heavy. In 1863, Union soldiers raided their farm. They whipped Jesse's stepfather, Reuben Samuel. They interrogated his mother while tying her up, just because his older brother Frank was fighting with Quantrill's raiders. That day, something broke inside 16-year-old Jesse James, and a monster was born. Jesse joined Quantrill's raiders. William Quantrill was the Civil War's most ruthless guerrilla leader. They weren't a regular army. Ambushes, raids, mass executions. Young Jesse grew up in the midst of this savagery. He killed his first man at 17, his second at 17, his third. Records weren't kept anymore. The war ended in 1865. The South lost. But for Jesse, the war never ended. When he tried to surrender, Union soldiers opened fire. He was shot in the chest. For months, they thought he was dead. But he survived. And when he returned, he was no longer Jesse James. He was something else. This is where the legend begins. In 1866, with his brother Frank, he carried out his first bank robberies. Liberty, Missouri. Target, Clay County Savings Association. Result, $60,000. The biggest bank robbery in history up to that point. And a civilian had died. But for Jesse, this was just the beginning. But the real genius was Jesse's ability to use the media. After the robbery, he sent letters to local newspapers. "We steal from the rich, we give to the poor," it said. "We are Civil War victims. The government victimized us." The people wanted to believe, and they believed. There was a journalist named John Newman Edwards. He was a Confederate supporter during the war. He started writing Jesse's story. His articles created the legend. Jesse James became a folk hero. But in reality, he was just a criminal, just a very smart criminal. Between 1867 and 1873, the James Younger Gang robbed 12 banks, 5 stagecoaches, and 3 trains. Each robbery was more audacious, each escape more sensational. The police couldn't catch them, because the people were hiding them, supporting them. Cole Younger and his brothers, Jim, John, and Bob, joined the gang. Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, Bill Chadwell, 8 men, 8 death machines, and Jesse, leader of them all. But by 1873, Jesse had become paranoid. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was after him. Allen Pinkerton's men were searching for them nationwide. Wanted posters were in every state. $5,000 for Jesse James's head, dead or alive. That's when Jesse made a decision. One last big heist. A heist so big they could live comfortably for the rest of their lives. And the target was clear. Chicago Rock Island and Pacific Railroad's money car. April 1873. Jesse's sources were working in Chicago. They were leaking information from inside the railroad companies, and the intelligence they received was this. On the night of July 21st, train number 4 would be carrying $200,000 in cash from eastern banks to the west. $200,000. That's $4.5 million in today's money. Jesse immediately sprang into action, but this time everything would be different. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a message. To the railroad companies, to the government, to the Pinkertons. The message: you can't stop us. Planning began in May. Jesse, Frank, Cole, and the others scouted near the town of Adair, Iowa. They studied the train route, bridges, curves, stations. They noted every detail. The essence of the plan was this: remove the rails while the train was rounding a curve. The locomotive would be disabled, the train would stop, and they would enter the money car and take the cash. Simple, effective, deadly. But Jesse didn't account for one thing: the reliability of his information source. At the beginning of July, their Chicago connections confirmed the final details. Yes, July 21st. Yes, $200,000. Yes, train number 4. Everything was correct, or so it seemed. On the night of July 20th, the gang arrived in Adair. 8 men. They made camp in a remote area away from town. Jesse seemed nervous. Frank was trying to calm him down. Cole Younger maintained his usual confidence. "Tomorrow night we'll be rich," Cole said. "No more running from anyone." Clell Miller was less optimistic. "What if something goes wrong?" he asked. Jesse looked at him in such a way that Clell didn't ask any more questions. July 21st, 1873. The day history books would write about, but nobody knew how they would write it. At 10 p.m., the gang moved into action. They positioned themselves by the rails. Their plan was perfect. A rail was removed with a crowbar. It was lightly placed back to appear still attached. When the train's weight hit it, the rail would come out. The locomotive would derail. 11:30 p.m. A whistle sounded in the distance. The train was coming. Jesse's heart was racing, but there was no emotion on his face. He was cold, calculated. This was his game. As the train approached, the vibration intensified. Lantern lights cut through the darkness. The locomotive's smoke rose into the sky. And then, crash! The rail came out. The locomotive overturned. The sound of metal scraping against metal deafened the ears. Sparks flew in every direction. Cars piled on top of each other. Passengers screamed. "Now!" Jesse shouted. 8 men ran. They passed by the burning locomotive. They slipped between the cars and reached the money car. The door was locked. Predictable. "Open the door!" Cole shouted. No sound from inside. Jesse placed dynamite. "Get back!" The explosion shattered the car door. They ran inside through the smoke. And at that moment, Jesse James's life changed. The car was empty. No, not completely empty. In the back corner was a small safe, but apparently this wasn't the money car. It was a cargo car. "What?" Cole ran to the safe. He broke the lock, opened it. $3,000. Not 200,000. 3,000. Silence. Such deep silence they could hear the creaking of the train wreckage. "The information was wrong," Frank whispered. Cole turned to Jesse. His face was bright red. "Wrong? We planned for a month. We derailed a train. There are passengers inside. Injured people. Police are coming down the road. And you made us do this for $3 lousy thousand? But worse was coming. One of the cars was on fire. Passengers inside were trying to get out. And then, a scream. A woman's scream. Jesse ran there. In the overturned car, a woman was trapped. Next to her was a small child, maybe 5 to 6 years old. "Help!" the woman was screaming. Jesse stopped. The voices inside him. "Leave her! Police are coming! Run!" But another voice. "That woman could be your mother. That child could be you." Frank came up beside him. "Jesse, we have to go." "We have to get her out." "There's no time." Jesse didn't even look at his brother. He climbed into the wreckage of the car. The wood was creaking. Flames approached. His hands were burning, but he didn't care. He pulled the woman, took the child, got them out. The woman was trembling. Fear was in her eyes. But she also said something. "Thank you." Jesse said nothing. He turned and ran into the darkness. As the gang fled, they left disaster behind. Engineer John Rafferty was seriously injured. 2 passengers died, 12 people were wounded, and the money stolen, $3,000, $375 per man. The next day, the newspapers went crazy. "Jesse James derails train, terror," read the headlines. "Treacherous outlaw kills innocent people." Even John Newman Edwards couldn't defend him this time. Public opinion had turned against Jesse. He was no longer a folk hero. He was a killer. But the real disaster was elsewhere. The Pinkerton Detective Agency took action. Alan Pinkerton personally took charge. He gave the order. Bring Jesse James in dead or alive. And his men were determined. August 1873. Pinkerton agents raided the James farm in Missouri. But Jesse wasn't there. Only his mother Zerelda and stepfather Reuben were there, and his 8-year-old half-brother Archie. The agents threw a bomb into the house. Their target was to kill Jesse, but Jesse wasn't there. The explosion killed Archie, an 8-year-old child. Zerelda's right arm was blown off. When Jesse got the news, he was devastated, but he didn't shed tears. He was too angry to cry. "They came for my family," he told Frank. "I'm going for their families." And at that point, Jesse James completely changed. There was no more Robin Hood, only revenge. September 1873. Jesse found his Chicago source. His name was Thomas Mims. He worked for the railroad company, but he also worked for Pinkerton. He had tried to set Jesse up. He had given false information. The goal, draw Jesse to a crime scene where he could be caught. Jesse found him in Kansas, behind a hotel, alone. "Do you know me?" Jesse asked. Thomas was trembling. "Please, I have a family." "I had one too," Jesse said, and pulled the trigger. But revenge wasn't enough. It never would be. October 1873. The gang disbanded. Cole Younger left. "I can't work with you anymore, Jesse," he said. "You've changed. You're not doing this for money anymore. You're doing it for revenge, and that's going to kill us." Cole was right. Between 1874 and 1876, the gang shrank. But the robberies continued. Each robbery was more savage, each escape harder. Police were everywhere now. September 7th, 1876, Northfield, Minnesota. The James Younger gang attempted their last big heist. First National Bank. Target, $200,000, the same number again. It had become Jesse's obsession, but something was different in Northfield. The town was ready, the citizens were armed, and it was a trap for the gang. When the bank was raided, the townsfolk opened fire. The street turned into a war zone. Clell Miller died. Bill Chadwell died. Charlie Pitts was wounded. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger were captured. Only Jesse and Frank managed to escape. 8 men had entered Northfield. 2 men came out. For Jesse, the game was over. But he wouldn't accept it. Between 1876 and 1882, Jesse lived in hiding. He changed his name. He became Thomas Howard. He hid in a small house in Missouri with his wife Z and 2 children. But he couldn't find peace. Every sound seemed like an enemy to him. Every stranger was a Pinkerton agent. He formed a new gang. But they weren't like the old men. They weren't loyal. They weren't skilled. They were greedy. One of them was Bob Ford, a 20-year-old aspiring outlaw. Jesse trusted him. But Bob's eyes were on the reward. The Missouri governor had put a $10,000 bounty on Jesse. April 3rd, 1882. St. Joseph, Missouri. Jesse was at home. He was straightening a picture on the wall. He had removed his gun. For the first time. For the first time in his life, he was caught unarmed. Bob Ford was behind him, a .44 caliber pistol in his hand, one single bullet through the back of his head. Jesse James fell to the ground. He was 34 years old. Bob Ford ran outside. "I killed Jesse James," he was shouting. "I want the reward." He got the reward, $10,000. But the price was heavy. America knew him as that coward Bob Ford, a man who shot someone from behind, who betrayed a friend. 10 years later, Bob was also killed, in a bar in Colorado, by bounty hunter Ed O'Kelly, just like Jesse, from behind. But Jesse James's story didn't end there. The legend grew. Newspapers declared him a martyr. He became a folk hero again. Over time, people forgot the truth. They forgot the murders. They forgot the dead. They only remembered the legend. So who was Jesse James really? A folk hero? No. He never gave to the poor. He kept the money he stole for himself. A victim? Partly. Yes, the Civil War destroyed him. Yes, the government oppressed his family. But that didn't make him innocent. He was just a man, a trauma victim, angry at the system, seeking revenge. And that anger turned him into a monster. The Adair train robbery was Jesse's turning point. That night they found $3,000 instead of $200,000. But more importantly, that night the Jesse James legend shattered. The people abandoned him, police surrounded him, his gang disbanded, and most importantly, that night Jesse lost his own humanity. He saved a woman and child, yes, but at the same time, 2 people died on that train. 12 people were wounded. Engineer John Rafferty lived the rest of his life disabled. Jesse's plan was flawless, but the information was wrong. And that one piece of wrong information changed the course of history. What would have happened if he'd found $200,000 that night? Maybe he would have retired. Maybe he would have returned to his farm. Maybe Northfield would never have happened. Maybe he never would have met Bob Ford. But the truth is, Jesse James could never stop. Because what he was looking for wasn't money. It was revenge. And revenge never ends. In 1995, historians opened Jesse James's grave. They did a DNA test. Yes, it was really him. The legend was real. But they found something else there. In Jesse's skull, the mark of Bob Ford's bullet. A small hole. Entry from the back of the head. Exit from the front. A moment of betrayal. A moment frozen by history. Today we remember Jesse James. Movies, TV shows, books. Always the same story. Folk hero. Robin Hood. Legend. But nobody talks about the real truth. He was a man chasing desperate revenge, fighting for his family, but losing himself while fighting. The train at Adair is still there. The rails are still there. The place where 8 men waited that night is still there, but Jesse James is gone now. Only his legend remains. And maybe that's the biggest robbery. Jesse James robbed history. He stole its truth and left a legend in its place. So what do you think? Was Jesse James a hero or a killer? The answer is maybe both, or neither. But one thing is certain. The disaster that began in Adair that night killed Jesse James. Bob Ford just pulled the trigger.